Russia is openly preparing a new phase of attacks against Ukraine. Moscow is now talking about systematic strikes on Kyiv. Analysts warn Russia could launch drones from Belarus directly toward the Kyiv-Chop highway and western supply routes from Poland. Putin's so-called super weapon Oreshnik may not be so powerful after all. Europe is discussing who could negotiate with the Kremlin. Poland wants to produce Patriot interceptor missiles, and while the war continues, thousands of Russians are escaping to Thailand. Hello friends, this is Natalia Lutsenko and let's begin. Russia is openly preparing for a new wave of long-term attacks against Ukraine. After Sergei Lavrov's call with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Moscow started talking about so-called systematic strikes on Kyiv. And now Russian Major General Sergei Lipovoy is openly explaining what that actually means. According to him, these attacks are no longer about intimidation or symbolic pressure, but about trying to physically destroy Ukrainian infrastructure and decision-making centers. So while the Kremlin publicly talks about peace talks and balance of interests, it is simultaneously promising more missile strikes on the Ukrainian capital.
Systematic strikes mean that the attacks will be carried out not only to damage these facilities, but to destroy them. We are talking about Ukrainian military facilities and decision-making centers. This will be consistent and systematic work.
And Russians are now trying to turn strikes on Kyiv into a bureaucratic term. Not terror, not missile attacks, but systematic strikes.
Systematic does not mean periodic. It is not the same as periodicity. Everything was said exhaustively in the Foreign Ministry's statement.
Russia may be preparing a new scenario against Ukraine, launching drones from Belarus toward the Kyiv-Chop highway and key supply routes from Poland. That's according to the American Institute for the Study of War. Analysts say Belarusian officials suddenly started talking a lot about Ukrainian drones allegedly violating Belarusian airspace. Institute for the Study of War believes this could be information groundwork for future Russian strikes launched from Belarusian territory under the excuse of retaliation. At the same time, analysts does not believe a new ground invasion from Belarus is realistic right now. Russia does not have enough reserves and there is no major troop buildup near the border. But air attacks are a completely different story. If Russia starts launching Shahed drones and cheaper Molniya drones from Belarus, it could hit western Ukraine much more precisely, including railways, supply convoys and logistics routes bringing Western aid from Poland.
Russia and Belarus appear to be setting conditions to justify Russia launching drone strikes at Ukraine from Belarus. Belarusian territory would allow Russia to conduct continuous strikes against Ukrainian logistics routes in western and northwestern Ukraine, including the M06 Kyiv to Chop highway and supply routes from Poland. Launching drones from Belarus would allow Russian forces to use remotely controlled Shahed and Molniya drones, increasing strike precision and the ability to target moving objects. Ukrainian officials already reported that a Russian drone operator based in Belarus attacked a freight train near Korostin in December 2025. Analysts believe recent statements from Minsk and warnings from Kyiv suggest that Russia is preparing information conditions for deeper military use of Belarus.
And this week, Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya officially visited Kyiv for the first time. Many in Ukraine saw the visit not only as a political gesture, but also as a part of a much bigger conversation about Belarus' future role in Russia's war against Ukraine. Political strategist Michael Shetelman says some military planners may already be discussing pressure scenarios against Lukashenko's regime involving the Belarusian opposition and even possible Baltic involvement.
Lithuanian troops cannot enter Russia because that would violate international law. But Belarus is different because Belarus entered the war from day one and directly threatened the Baltic states. In theory, intervention could be seen as legitimate if requested by the legitimate president of Belarus, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. I think this scenario is already being discussed both in Ukrainian headquarters and inside NATO regional command structures. The point is not whether it will happen. The point is for this threat to exist, both for Belarus and for Russia.
Meanwhile, Putin's so-called wonder weapon Oreshnik may not be as terrifying as the Kremlin claims. German outlet Welt writes that the missile's biggest weakness is poor accuracy. Yes, it is difficult to intercept because of its speed and trajectory, but for precision strikes, it performs badly. After the latest launch, the missile landed near Bila Tserkva, outside Kyiv. Instead of a major military result, it caused fires in a garage area. In other words, a missile worth tens of millions of dollars delivered more propaganda effect than battlefield impact.
Oreshnik's main problem is low strike accuracy. Despite speeds above Mach 10 and the difficulty of interception for air defense systems, its real battlefield effectiveness remains limited. During atmospheric re-entry, a plasma layer forms around the missile and blocks radio and satellite signals. Because of this, the missile struggles to correct its course during the final phase of flight. That is why experts describe it more as a weapon of intimidation than an effective precision strike system.
Russia is currently not capable of launching a major offensive against NATO, but the alliance must be ready for sabotage, provocations, and hybrid attacks. That's according to Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski. He said that if Russia were truly preparing for a large-scale attack against NATO, it would be visible in advance, just like the West saw the months-long Russian troop build-up before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, Sikorski warned that Putin's intentions turned out to be far more aggressive than Western Europe had expected. That is why, he says, nobody is underestimating Russia anymore.
Russia is threatening us, and we must take it seriously. Russia is not currently in a position to launch a major offensive against NATO. And if it were preparing to do so, we would see it. We have satellite reconnaissance. We saw the buildup of 100,000 troops around Ukraine, which grew over months. Today, we see that Putin's intentions are worse than Western Europe expected, so no one will take this lightly. Russia is capable of sabotage operations or provocations carried out below the threshold of a true invasion. NATO must also be prepared for such actions.
Poland wants to produce Patriot interceptor missile on its own territory. But even with the US approval, this is not a quick process. Defense Express writes that Poland is only at the beginning of this path. Ahead years of technical agreements, technology transfer, and setting up production lines. The example of Japan shows how long this can take. Japan is the only country outside the United States that has licensed production of these Patriot interceptor missiles, and even there, it took more than 5 years to move from agreements to serial production. So for Poland, the realistic timeline is not months, but years, possibly 5 to 10.
Poland is only at the beginning of the path toward localizing PAC-3 missile production for Patriot systems. Years of negotiations, technology transfer, and industrial deployment still lie ahead. Even the production of separate launch container elements in Poland took almost 7 years from the first agreements to the first completed batch. For comparison, Japan, the only country outside the United States with licensed PAC-3 assembly, needed more than 5 years to move from agreements to serial production. And even there, key missile components, including the engine and seeker, are still supplied from the United States.
Europe is now thinking more seriously about direct talks with the Kremlin on Russia's war against Ukraine. After US mediation efforts basically reached a dead end, the EU started discussing its own representative for possible contacts with Moscow. Among the names mentioned were Angela Merkel, Mario Draghi, and Finnish President Alexander Stubb. Stubb said he probably could not say no if he were offered such a role, but only after Russia agrees to a ceasefire. At the same time, the BBC writes that the main problem is simple, that the Kremlin does not see Europe as a neutral site. Moscow accuses the EU of military support for Ukraine and still prefers talking to the United States rather than to Europeans.
Russia accuses the European Union of military support for Kyiv and of undermining US peace efforts. That is why it is hard to imagine Moscow engaging with Europeans in any meaningful way. Russia prefers to talk to the United States, partly because of status and partly because Donald Trump's envoys have put much more pressure on Kyiv than on Moscow. Now, the EU wants to join the process and make sure that any deal, if it ever happens, is good for both Ukraine and European security. Ukraine wants to break the deadlock and is pushing for progress.
While Russia continues its war against Ukraine, some Russians have found an almost resort-style way to escape the war on Thailand's Phuket Island. The New York Times reports that around 30,000 Russians have settled there since the full-scale invasion began. A whole little Russian world has appeared on the island. Russian saunas, grocery stores, concerts by Russian performers, and daily Aeroflot flights from Moscow. According to the report, some men left Russia to avoid military conscription, but even in Phuket, the war is catching up with them. Through visa problems, money issues, and growing anger from locals, while some Russians launched missiles at Ukraine, others are buying property in Thailand and trying very hard to live as if the war is somewhere far away and has nothing to do with them.
Signs of Russian influence are everywhere on the island. Russian saunas thriving despite the tropical weather, Russian grocery stores selling products from home, and daily flights to Phuket by the Russian state airline Aeroflot. But as Phuket's Russian community has grown, so has local resentment over Russians buying property, opening businesses, and, critics say, abusing Thailand's visa system to work illegally. Some are young men who left Russia to avoid conscription. When their visa-free stay expires, many Russians pay $150 to be driven across the border and back simply to reset the clock on their stay.
Thousands of Ukrainians have lost limbs during Russia's war. Soldiers and civilians alike. Missile strikes, drones, artillery and mines continue to leave people learning how to live all over again. In Kryvyi Rih, Irina Nakonechna lost her husband and her left leg after a Russian missile strike near a hotel where the couple had been walking on a warm spring evening. Her husband died the next day. Now she's learning to walk with a prosthetic, climb stairs again, and rebuild a completely different life. She says the hardest part was not only physical recovery, but accepting herself after everything changed.
About 2 months later, I sat down for the first time, and it felt like I had come out of hell and was starting to recover. There were so many surprising emotions. There was a lot of joy. I don't know how to describe those feelings, but it was really cool.
Thank you for watching, and that's all for now.